I'm going to take you through the text, which it's easier to do it that way, and it's also more fun, and I like it because you actually see what I'm trying to do with sentences. But so I'm going to go straight into that because it's, let's go straight into that, and you can see what I'm up to. So here we are. My sense of humor. And this is taken from the humor book written many moons ago. And the Nordic context is, it's for the conference, and it's the context in which the book was written. Much of this book was written during stays in Stockholm in the late 1990s and thereafter. So, and also, you know, I've got a lot to say about the Nordic context, or at least some things to say about the Nordic context, some things which are not kind, some things which are very kind. I mean, I'm a great fan of Danish humor in particular. So I've kind of adopted certain tropes which will be peculiarly irritating from a Swedish point of view. But there we are. Let's just start. Jokes tear holes in our usual predictions about the empirical world. We might say that humor is produced by a disjunction between the way things are and the way they're represented in the joke, between expectation and actuality. Humor defeats our expectations by producing a novel actuality, by changing the situation in which we find ourselves. This is a key theme for me, changing the situation. Examples are legion, from boy bishops reciting learned sermons to talking ballerinas, hamsters and bears, to farting professors and incontinent ballerinas, to straight linguistic inversion. I could wait for you until the cows come home. On second thoughts, I'll either wait for the cows until you come home. It's a Marx Brothers reference. On second thought, this is hardly news. One already finds Cicero writing in De Oratore. The most common kind of joke is that in which we expect one thing and another is said. Here, our own disappointed expectation makes us laugh. So the comic world is not simply the inverted world, die verkehrte Welt, of philosophy, but rather the world with its causal chains broken, its social practices turned inside out, and common sense rationality left in tatters. Of course, a similar expectation between expectation and actuality might itself be claimed in the relation between the various objects of humor and any theoretical explanation thereof. The difference being that a theory of humor is not humorous, or at least that's the standard view. A joke explained is a joke misunderstood. In this case, what might make one laugh as dramatic irony is the audacity or arrogance of the attempt to write a philosophy of humor. This is not my view. But for example, it's interesting, persons who might feel themselves to be, would not feel themselves to be experts in metapsychology or French spiritualism, somehow feel confident in dismissing Freud's theory of jokes or Bergson's account of laughter, because they're either not funny or simply miss the point. When it comes to what amuses us, we're all authorities, experts in the field. That's the interesting point. We know what we find funny. Such a claim to implicit or tacit knowledge is interesting in itself, for reasons I explain elsewhere. However, the fact remains that humor is an impossible object for a philosopher, but therein lies its attraction. I then go through the three main theories of humor, which shouldn't be surprising to you. Let me just run through them quickly. And the three main explanations of humor, and in the book and in the research I've done over the years, it's in philosophy, but in literary history, theology, history of religion, sociology, and anthropology. Anthropology is a very good field for thinking about humor, as we'll see. Three main explanations: the superiority theory, the relief theory, and the incongruity theory. So what is humor? Here are three theories. The first theory, represented by Plato, Aristotle, Quintilian, and at the dawn of the modern era, Hobbes, we laugh from feelings of superiority over other people. from, quoting Hobbes, sudden glory arising from sudden conception of some eminency in ourselves by comparison with the infirmities of others and with our own formerly. Laughter is that passion which hath no name, again Hobbes, which would be forbidden to virtuous guardians of Plato's imagined philosophical city. It's the superiority theory that dominates the philosophical tradition until the 18th century. And we shall have record. Yes, so there's that. The second theory is the relief theory that emerges in the 19th century, the influence of the work of Herbert Spencer, where laughter is explained as a release of pent-up nervous energy. But the theory is best known in the version given in Freud's 1905 Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, which I still insist is a fantastic book, too little read, where the energy that is relieved and discharged in laughter provides pleasure because it allegedly economizes upon energy that would ordinarily be used to contain or repress psychic activity. So humor is relief of unconscious energy. The third theory, which I think is the best theory, is the incongruity theory, which can be traced to the great Scottish-Irish thinker Francis Hutcheson, Reflections upon Laughter from 1750. It's elaborated in related but distinct ways in Kant, who of course was proud of his Scottish ancestry, and as we shall see presently, I won't show this now, but in Schopenhauer and in Kierkegaard. As James Russell Lowell writes in 1870, humor in its first analysis is a perception of the incongruous. Humor is produced by the experience of a felt incongruity between what we know or expect to be the case and what actually takes place in the joke, gag, jest, or blag. I want to begin with this theory of humor as incongruity. The phenomenology of a joke. Can we describe what takes place in a joke? How might we give what philosophers call a phenomenology of a joke? Firstly, joking is a specific and meaningful practice that the audience and the joke teller recognize as such. There's a tacit social contract here, namely some agreement about the social world in which we find ourselves as the implicit background to the joke. There can't be humor without that, it seems to me. There has to be some sort of tacit consensus or implicit shared understanding as to what constitutes joking for us, as to which linguistic and visual routines are recognized as joking. That is, in order for the incongruity of the joke to be seen as such, there has to be a congruence between joke structure and social structure. No social congruity, no comic incongruity. When this implicit congruence or tacit contract is missing, as it often is in the world, then laughter will probably not result. People will be offended, which can be the experience of trying or failing to tell a joke in a foreign language. Bergson explains what he calls the leading idea in our investigations in le rire, laughter. To understand laughter, we must put it back into its natural environment, which is society. And above all, we must determine the utility of its function, which is a social one. Laughter must answer to certain requirements of life in common. It must have a social signification. So, in listening to a joke, I'm presupposing a social world that is shared, the forms of which the practice of joke telling is going to play with. Joking is a game that players only play successfully when they both understand and follow the rules. And Wittgenstein puts the point perspicuously. What is it for people not to have the same sense of humor? They do not react properly to each other. It's as though there were a custom amongst certain people for one person to throw another a ball, which he's supposed to catch and throw back, but some people, instead of throwing it back, put it in their pocket. This is also what the great, someone that I've read more and more over the years, Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas has in mind in her groundbreaking work, anthropological work on the subject, when she compares jokes with rites. A rite here is understood as a symbolic act that derives its meaning from a cluster of socially legitimated symbols, such as a funeral. But insofar as the joke plays with the symbolic forms of society, The bishop gets stuck in a lift or an elevator. I spread margarine on the communion wafer. Jokes are anti-rites. They mock, parody, or deride the ritual practices of a given society. As Milan Kundera remarks, someone's hat falls on the coffin in a freshly dug grave. The funeral loses its meaning and laughter is born. There is right becoming anti-right. Suppose that someone starts to tell you a joke. This was actually one of my father's favorite jokes. Suppose that someone starts to tell you a joke. I never left the house as a child. My family was so poor that my mother couldn't afford to buy us clothes. Firstly, I recognize that a joke is being told, and I assent to having my attention caught in this way. Assenting to having my attention caught is very important. If someone interrupts the joke teller or simply walks away in the middle of the joke, then the tacit social contract of humor has been broken. This is bad form or simply bad manners. Instead of throwing the ball back, I put it in my pocket. In thus assenting and going along with the joke, a certain tension is created in the listener, and I follow along willingly with the story that's being recounted. When the punchline kicks in and the little bubble of tension pops, I experience an affect, an emotion that can be described as pleasure, and I laugh or just smile. When I was 10, my mother bought me a hat so that I could look out the window. It's the punchline of that joke. I love that joke. What happens here is, as Kant puts it in a brilliant short description of laughter from the Critique of Judgment, a sudden evaporation of expectation to nothing. Let me read the German, because it's kind of funny. Ein Affekt aus der plötzlichen Verwandlung einer gespannten Erwartung in nichts. In hearing the punchline, the tension disappears and we experience comic relief. Rather than the tiresome and indeed racist examples of jokes that Kant recounts involving Indians and bottles of beer, sort of strange when you look at Kant. Witness Philip Larkin. There's also a meta joke because he was also racist in his way. This is a characteristic Larkin flourish, and it is an example of it becoming incongruity. You're building up tension and then you release it through an incongruous conclusion. Larkin. Let me try and do a Larkin voice. When I drop 4 cubes of ice chimingly in a glass and add 3 goes of gin, a lemon slice, and let a 10-ounce tonic void in foaming gulps until it smothers everything else up to the edge, I lift the lot in silent pledge. He devoted his life to others. Obviously, that's the joke. The admittedly rather dry humor here is found in the combination of 2 features, conceptual and rhetorical. On the one hand, there is the conceptual disjunction between the hedonism involved in preparing the gin and tonic and the avowed altruism of the final line. But also, more importantly, there's the rhetorical effect generated by the sudden bathos of the final line in comparison to the cumulative, almost Miltonic overkill of what precedes it. So since the way jokes work, when you're dealing with someone who's an expert in telling jokes, it's about how long the joke can be told for, how long the expectation is drawn out. And in many ways, it's the expectation that's important and not the punchline. I could say a lot more about that. It's not the tale, it's the telling, right? Picking up on Hobbes's word, it's important to emphasize the necessary suddenness of the conceptual and rhetorical shift. Both brevity and speed are the soul of wit. Comic timing. Mention of the pathetic shift. So often jokes work through a bathos, through a kind of lowering of expectation. That's the humor. You kind of, whoa, you take it down a notch. That produces humor, brings attention to the peculiar temporal dimension of jokes. As any comedian will readily admit, timing is everything, and the mastery of comic forms involves a careful control of pauses, hesitations, and silences, of knowing exactly when to detonate the little dynamite of the joke. So a great comedian often does their comedy through doing nothing or apparently nothing. In this sense, jokes involve a shared knowledge of 2 temporal dimensions, of duration and the instant. What I mean is that if we give ourselves up to being told a joke, we undergo a peculiar and quite deliberative distension of time. Time stretches out, the joke is being told. The practice of joking involves a cumulative repetition and wonderfully needless circumlocution. Jokes often move in groups of three, Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman, whatever it might be, a Swede, a Norwegian, a Dane, whatever. And this technique is brought to its discursive nadir in the Shaggy Dog or the Cock and Bull story, such as Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Sterne. He says, digressions, incontestably, are the sunshine. They are the life, the soul of reading. Take them out of this book, for instance, you might as well take the book along with them. In being told a joke, we undergo a peculiar experience of duration through repetition and digression, of time literally being stretched out like an elastic band. We know that the elastic will snap, we just don't know when, and we find that anticipation rather pleasurable. It snaps with the punchline, which is the sudden acceleration of time, where the digressive stretching of the joke suddenly contracts into a heightened experience of the instant. We laugh. Viewed temporally, humorous pleasure would seem to be produced by the disjunction between duration and the instant, where we experience with renewed intensity both the slow passing of time and its sudden evanescence. Another point, which is, it's an important point, but I won't go on about it too much, is that the relation of humor to the body. The jokes invite a corporeal response, from a chuckle through a giggle to a guffaw. So, I mean, the point, I'll skip over this, I'll summarize this because I don't want to bore you to death. But this goes back to this discussion here of Descartes' passions of the soul and the body, and that's all true, right? Laughter is an expression that is expressed with the body when the body is kind of out of control, and it's like two other phenomena, namely weeping, crying, and orgasm. And this is a connection that the great philosophical anthropologist Helmut Plessner makes in his work. I recommend that you read it. But what interests me is not, because I want to get onto this bit, what interests me is not there's a tendency to reduce humor and laughter to the body, which is understandable. And there used to be a lot of interest in the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, who says some very interesting things along that line. For me, what's more important is the disjunction between the body and the mental in humor. That is really what's incongruous. What happens in humor is that we experience ourselves not just as bodily, but as as beings that do not coincide with our body. Okay, but is that it? Hopefully not. For I want to claim that humor is not just comic relief, a transient corporeal effect induced by the raising and extinguishing of tension, of as little social consequence as masturbation, although slightly more acceptable to perform in public. I rather want to claim that what goes on in humor is a form of liberation or elevation, which expresses something essential to what Plessner calls the humanity of the human. I make good on this claim in extended discussion of Freud's conception of humor, which I won't do here, it's in the book on humor. But a provisional outline, I've got a nicer outline, is from this very important 1976 play by someone called Trevor Griffiths, which is called Comedians, which I would urge you can find this on YouTube, and it's great. It really holds up. It's about people learning to be comics in 1970s Manchester. And the character Eddie Waters says the following remark. I think this is just spot on. A real comedian, that's a daring man, or woman, or whatever. He dares to see what his listeners shy away from, fear to express. And what he sees is a sort of truth about people, about their situation, about what hurts or terrifies them, about what's hard, above all, about what they want. A joke releases the tension, says the unsayable, any joke pretty well. But a true joke, a comedian's joke, has to do more than release tension. It has to liberate the will and the desire. It has to change the situation. So anyone can tell a joke. Anyone can talk funny. I mean, big deal, right? A true joke is a joke that uses that and then does something else. It changes the situation in which we find ourselves. So a true joke, a comedian's joke, suddenly and explosively lets us see the familiar, defamiliarize the ordinary made extraordinary, and the real rendered surreal, and we laugh in a physiological squeal of transient delight, like an infant playing peekaboo. Nurse to cooperative, uncooperative patient. We have to see if you have a temperature. Uncooperative patient to nurse. Don't be silly. Everybody has a temperature. Humor brings about a change of situation, a surrealization of the real, which is why someone like the great surrealist André Breton was so interested in humor. In particular, the unsentimental subversions of what he baptized l'humour noir. A change in situation can be caught in Mary Douglas's claim that a joke is a play upon form that affords an opportunity for realizing that an accepted pattern has no necessity. It's a very important point. It means that jokes are ways of realizing the contingency of social formations. Thus, jokes are a play upon form where what is played with are the accepted practices of a given society. The incongruities of humor both speak out of a massive congruence between joke structure and social structure, and speak against those structures by showing that they have no necessity. The anti-right of the joke shows the sheer contingency or arbitrariness of the social rights in which we engage. By producing a consciousness of contingency, humor can change the situation in which we find ourselves and can even have a critical function with respect to society. Hence the great importance that humor has played in social movements that have set out to criticize the established order, such as radical feminist humor. This is a joke from the early 80s in London. How many men does it take to tile a bathroom? I don't know. It depends how thinly you slice them. As the Italian situationist street slogan has it, una risata di seppellire. It will be a laugh that buries you. And there's also, that was a phrase that was picked up, particularly in the German context in the 70s and 80s, in interesting ways. It will be a laugh that buries you, where the you refers to those in power. I think that's changed in the last 10, 15 years. We could talk about that. By laughing at power, we expose its contingency. We realize that what appeared to be fixed and oppressive is in fact the emperor's new clothes. It's just a sort of thing that should be mocked and ridiculed. Then I go into a little discussion of reactionary humor, because although you can say, well, yeah, humor is liberation, changing the situation, isn't that all wonderful? Well, the fact is most humor is fairly reactionary, and how do we explain that? And, most jokes actually serve to reinforce social consensus. I have some Nordic examples in mind, which would have to be said privately. The jokes that, let's say, Nordic peoples say about each other behind each other's backs, which are very amusing, but hardly kind of revolutionary. And there's a ton to say there, but I'm going to skip over that. I think that reactionary humor, sort of nationalist humor, is interesting and important. It reveals something powerful about the way we're bound to a particular culture. So you can't just ignore it, and you can't say that's not funny. It's deeper than that. But I want to get on to this stuff here. So the conclusion of that, we have to acknowledge reactionary humor as well. The reactionary quality of much humor, in particular ethnic humor, must be analyzed, which I will attempt elsewhere, where I claim that such humor lets us reflect on the anxious nature of our thrownness in the world. What I mean by the latter is that in its untruth, as it were, reactionary humor tells us important truths about who we are. Jokes can therefore be read as symptoms of societal repression, and their study might be said to amount to a return of the repressed. In other words, humor can reveal us to be persons, frankly, that we'd rather not be. That's the punchline. Next two bits. And as you might already notice, I don't know, but a lot of this work, when I did it, was rooted in the 18th century. I'm very fond of the 18th century because it's, in many ways, it sets the map for the way we think about a whole number of phenomena. So you'll see some of that in discussions of Jonathan Swift and then Lawrence Stern. Okay, to talk as I do of true humor must presuppose some sort of normative talk, some sort of normative claim, namely a distinction between good and bad jokes. I think we kind of have to do this. However, such a claim between good and bad jokes mustn't be reduced to moral Knäckebrot. It must be properly leavened and smeared with tasty examples. I try and do this later in the humor book, where I make the distinction between laughing at oneself and laughing at others. So one way you can think about good and bad jokes is in terms of laughing at yourself and laughing at others. It's much more complicated than that, but this is a rough and ready line. In my view, true humor does not wound a specific victim and always contains self-mockery. This is a point which I think has become much more contestable in recent years, but let's just put it out there. The object of laughter is the subject who laughs. By way of preparation for this thought, we might cite a few of the closing lines from the verses of the death of Dr. Swift. These are the lines that Swift writes about his own death. An exquisitely bleak apology for his life, an apology pro sua vita. So this is Swift. Perhaps I may allow the Dean had too much satire in his vein, and seemed determined not to starve it, because no age could more deserve it. Yet malice never was his aim. He lashed the vice but spared the name. No individual could resent where thousands equally were meant. His satire points at no defect, but what all mortals may correct. For he abhorred that senseless tribe who call it humour when they jibe. He spared a hump or crooked nose, whose owners set not up for bow. True genuine dullness moved his pity, unless it offered to be witty. Wonderful lines. The critical task of humour, then, would not be sheer malice or jibing, but the lashing of vices which are general and not personal. No individual could resent where thousands equally were meant. Also, such lashing of vices does not point at a fundamental defect, but what all mortals may correct. That is, true humour can be said to have a therapeutic as well as a critical function. The studied reversals of perspective and fantastical geographical displacements of Swift's Gulliver's Travels offer, it is true, a devastating critique of the follies and vices of the modern European world of the 18th century. But the intent of the satire is therapeutic, to bring human beings back from what they've become to what they might be. Satire is often a question of scale, of the familiar becoming infinitely small or grotesquely huge, which can be seen in Gulliver's Voyages, from the littleness of Lilliput to the bigness of Brobdingnag. But I would insist, from the studied savaging of modern mathematics, science and government in Laputa and the Academy of Legarda, this is book 3 of the Travels, through to the final descent into misanthropy caused by the life with the fully rational animals of the land of the Houyhnhnms. Right, so Swift's point is that if human beings are rational animals, then why not horses? Swift is offering a teaching of virtue that permits Gulliver and the rest of us to be reconciled to life amongst the vicious yahoos. That's us, shitting in trees and such like. In my view, this is what Swift means when he complains to Alexander Pope from 1725. I tell you, after all, that I do not hate mankind. It is you others, vous autres, as in French, who hate them, because you would have them reasonable animals and are angry for being disappointed. For after all, I am a Yahoo and you are too. So as well as being something of a revenge of the 18th century against the present, the book on humour defends a twofold claim. That the tiny explosions of humour we call jokes return us to a common familiar world of shared practices, the background meanings implicit in a culture. That's kind of the anthropological claim. And two, indicate how those practices might be transformed or perfected, how things might be otherwise. Humour both reveals the situation, it indicates how that situation might be changed. As to say, this is my optimistic conclusion, that laughter has a certain redemptive or messianic power. So does this mean that true humour has to be religious? In the book on humour, I don't really talk about the relation between humour and religion because I couldn't figure it out at the time, and I still struggle to figure it out because it is a tricky topic, given that so much of what we think of as religion actually is comic, I mean, deliberately comic, and is not meant to be taken as seriously as certain, say, Lutherans would imagine. It's more complicated than that. The argumentation linking humour to religion is impeccable enough, and much great comic writing is Christian. Much of it is Catholic. Much of it is not. Particularly when one thinks of Pope, Swift, and Stern, and much of it is Irish as well. We have to come into that question, the relation between humour and colonialism in relationship to Irish experience. There is a book, The Briefest Glance at a Book by a wonderful scholar called M.A. Screech, Laughter at the Foot of the Cross, confirms the place of laughter in the Bible and in the self-understanding of Christianity through the ages. Right? So the central drama of Christianity is comic, right? It's a God who commits an act of folly by being nailed to a tree, right? This is the folly that we'll come back to. From the standpoint of the worldly wise, Christ appears to be a kind of madman. Where the world admires money, power, and success, the Christian indifference to these values turns the secular world upside down. It is this folly of the cross that Erasmus understood so well, and which makes his praise of folly a powerful work of comedy and confession. Christianity offers us a topsy-turvy world that inverts our worldly values. W.H. Auden is therefore quite right when he says, the world of laughter is much more closely related to the world of prayer than either to the everyday secular world of work. For both are worlds in which we are all equal, in the first as individual members of our species, in the latter as unique persons. In the world of work, on the other hand, we're not and cannot be equal, only diverse and interdependent. Those who try to live by work alone without laughter and prayer turn into insane lovers of power, tyrants who would enslave nature to their immediate desires, an attempt which can only end in utter catastrophe, shipwreck on the Isle of Sirens. If laughter lets us see the folly of the world in order to imagine a better world in its place and to change the situation in which we find ourselves, then I have no objection to the religious interpretation of humour. True jokes would therefore be like shared prayers. It's a thought which I'm reading that back, it's sort of interesting to me. I've got more thoughts. My quibble is rather the following, that the religious worldview invites us to look away from the world towards another in which, in Peter Berger's words, the limitations of the human condition are miraculously overcome. Humour lets us view the folly of the world by affording us the glimpse of another world, by offering what Berger calls a signal of transcendence. However, in my view, humour does not redeem us from this world, but returns us to it ineluctably by showing that there is no alternative. The consolations of humour come from acknowledging that this is the only world, imperfect as it is, and we are, and it is only here that we can make a difference. Therefore, the redemptive power of humour is not, as it is in Kierkegaard, the transition from the ethical to the religious point of view, where humour is the last stage of existential awareness before faith. Humour is not noumenal, but phenomenal, not theological, but anthropological, not numinous, but simply luminous. By showing us the folly of the world, humour does not save us from that folly by turning our attention elsewhere, as it does in great Christian humour like Erasmus, but calls on us to face the folly of the world and change the situation in which we find ourselves. So we're coming towards the end now, you'll be pleased to hear. And how shall I do this? I might skip the last bit because I could summarize that but I want to give you these jokes because they're good. So the point I'm making here, which I hope is fairly clear, that actually the relationship between humor and religion is complicated and interestingly complicated. And that view that I just expressed in the last paragraph, I mean, I would have to complicate that now. I think my views have developed considerably over the recent years. So I think, in a sense, that as it were, the self-consciously comic nature of, or let's say the self-consciously playful nature of religion is actually something extremely interesting to me. I think it's, we tend to misinterpret religion as seriousness from a secular point of view, and you fail to see its essential comedy. Okay, let me try and tie this up. Sensus and dissensus communis. Laughter is contagious. Think of the intersubjectivity of giggling, particularly when it concerns something obscene in a context where one should be serious, such as listening to a formal academic paper. In such cases, I'm sure or hope that we all know them, the laughter can really hurt. One can say that the simple telling of a joke recalls us to what is shared in our everyday practices. It makes explicit the enormous commonality that is implicit in our social life. This is what Shaftesbury had in mind in the early 18th century when he spoke of humour as a form of common sense. Sensus communis, sociability is a better term, sociability. So humour reveals the depths of what we share, but crucially it does this not through the clumsiness of a theoretical description, but more quietly, practically, and discreetly. Laughter suddenly breaks out when you're queuing up for a bus, watching a party political broadcast in a pub, or when someone farts in a lift. Humour is an exemplary practice because it's a universal human activity that invites us to become philosophical spectators upon our lives. It is practically enacted theory. And what's always interested me in philosophy is practically enacted theory. I think this is what Wittgenstein once said when he said he could imagine a book of philosophy that would be written entirely in the form of jokes. The extraordinary thing about humour is that it returns us to common sense by distancing us from it. Humour familiarizes us with the common world through its miniature strategies of defamiliarization. If humour recalls us to sensus communis, then it does so by momentarily pulling us out of common sense, where jokes function as moments of dissensus communis. So humour, return to common sense, requires sociability, but it also has this additional feature of twisting that, pulling us out of our common sense. At its most powerful, say, in those insanely pulling dialogues between Chico and Groucho Marx, the Marx Brothers, which for the younger people out there, if you've not spent time with the Marx Brothers, then do before you die. Humour is a paradoxical form of speech and action that defeats our expectations, producing laughter with its unexpected verbal inversions, contortions, and explosions. A refusal of everyday speech that lights up the everyday, showing it in Adorno's words, as will one day appear in the messianic light. So humour both reveals what we share and also it twists that, revealing in a different light, which I'm calling messianic here. Some sundry examples. What'll I say? Tell them you're not here. Suppose they don't believe me. They'll believe you when you start talking. Think of it logically. It makes no sense. The whole thing just explodes. It bursts. Do you believe in the life to come? Mine was always there. Have you lived in Blackpool all your life? Not yet. Do me a favor and close the window. It's cold outside. If I close it, will that make it warm outside? Do you want to use a pen? I can't write. That's okay. There wasn't any ink in it anyway. Which of the following is the odd one out? Greed, envy, malice, anger, and kindness. Pause. And gentlemen, Ciccolini here may talk like an idiot and look like an idiot, but don't let that fool you. He really is an idiot. I implore you, send him back to his father and brothers who are waiting for him with open arms at the penitentiary. I suggest that we give him 10 years at Leavenworth or 11 years at 12 Worth. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take 5 and 10 at Woolworth. That's it. So you get that sense of language out of control. Now, so I'll close it here. To put it in a rather baroque formulation, humor changes the situation in which we find ourselves. It lights up the everyday by providing an oblique phenomenology of ordinary life. And then I try and give an example of that with Tristram Shandy, the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, gentleman, this wonderfully bizarre 18th century novel, but it could be other examples as well. And the point of that is to try and show that well, you can read it for yourselves. You've got a copy of this, and so here we go. Last sentence. For Lawrence Stern. Oh, this is good. Oh, this is good. Yeah, let me do this. Yeah. So, great comedy, humor, often consists of digressions. In my opinion, the greatest comedian in the, let's say, in the English-speaking world of the last 20 years is someone called Stuart Lee. I'm a great fan of Stuart Lee. And if you've not studied Stuart Lee, there's tons of stuff on YouTube and the rest. And Stuart Lee doesn't tell jokes. He does extremely long, strange digressions, which take hours. And so, I mean, a great comic actually doesn't tell jokes. Telling jokes is the easy bit. Humor consists in something else, a digressive power. And this picks up on something that I'm taking from Lawrence Stern. Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, it's just one long extended digression. And the humor consists in the endless digressiveness of the text. For in this longer, yeah, this is what Stern says. By this contrivance, the machinery of my work is of a species it's by itself. Two contrary motions are introduced into it and reconciled, which were thought to be at variance with each other. In a word, my work is digressive and it is progressive too. And at the same time, in my digressions are my progressions. This is why, to recall my earlier citation from Lawrence Stern, digressions are the sunshine, the life and the soul of reading. Take them out of this book. For instance, you might as well take the book along with them. Inasmuch as this book, Stern's Tristram Shandy, digresses, it also progresses by a contrary motion. In my view, it's this combination of these two contrary motions, progressive and digressive, that's the heart of humor. That is to say, through the endless displacement of seeing the world through another's hobby horse, through the eyes of a Walter or a Toby Shandy or whoever it might be, a Stuart Lee, one is brought closer to the things themselves, to the finally laughable enigma of ordinary life. And with that, I will end. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
I'm back. Okay, great.
Well, I turned this so you can see me just for a couple of seconds, because now I hope there will be questions or
yeah, sure.
comments.
Can you give me 1 second? I'll be back in. I have to go and visit my grandmother. In other words, just use the bathroom for 1 second. I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Jag var rädd att han skulle åka iväg på en timme eller så. Okej. Men hon är inte bara... De som nu är intresserade av att ställa någon fråga eller så, får gärna komma fram och ställa sig här framme. Så att Simon kan se er och höra er. Därför att vi kan inte, reser man sig upp där borta, långt borta, så är det svårt liksom för honom att se och höra. Så man ska helst stå här framme, har vi konstaterat. Så ni får liksom kanske ställa en liten kö eller så här framme också. Jag hoppas att några av er gör det. Det finns mycket att diskutera. Precis, alltså, så riktar jag den här magiska kameran då alltså mot dig så att du kommer i bild och så hörs det rätt fint. Well. Hello again.
Hello.
Hello. You're ready for some questions? Or?
Great.
Great. Fine. We'll take the first one. I turn, as you can see, I will turn this camera now, and I hope you can see and hear everything now. Simon? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear it well. It all seems very clear.
Great. Thanks. Thank you very much for this talk, which picks up on the book, and you develop further your thoughts on humor. I was really struck by listening to you now, pointing out that you rooted these ideas in the 18th century, and how so much of what you describe in sort of the formal functioning of humor reminds us of how modernist aesthetics work. And I think, for instance, of Viktor Shklovsky's on artist technique, and you used the concept of defamiliarization at the end there, and that's sort of a common theme there. And I was thinking maybe you could comment further on the relationship between humor and aesthetics.
Good question.
And also because I've been interested in the works of Jacques Rancière, which I know you have as well. This connection to the 18th century, and how you discussed humor as the stretching of time, and perhaps his idea of empty time as central to the aesthetic regime of the arts, and how that relates to politics as well. So yeah, thank you again. This was immensely interesting.
All right, that's a great question. It's well, I mean to go all the way back, back to a long time ago. I had the idea of writing on comedy, right, and wrote a paper around questions of comedy, and then I realized that this was a kind of a rich area, but I couldn't get a handle on it. I couldn't get a fix on the phenomenon, and because it's too big. Comedy is just too huge a topic, because you can't exclude the Greeks, and you can't exclude whoever it might be, Rabelais, and all these huge amount of figures you've got to include. So I then discovered that humor was the phenomenon, and humor, obviously, it's an ancient word. It goes back to the doctrine of the four humours, and the medical thinking of Galen, and all the way back to Aristotle. But humor as meaning something jocular, something related to what's funny, only appears in English in the late 17th century. The first use I found in the Oxford English Dictionary was something like 1682 or thereabouts. And that's interesting. That just got me thinking that the humor is something which, and the first theory of humor that I really became aware of and began to use was Shaftesbury, writing in the early 18th century, Sensus Communis, an essay on the freedom of wit and humor. And Shaftesbury makes a distinction between, he's trying to, he's looking at the question of whether it's okay to ridicule people, what's going on in what he calls raillery or ridicule. And the conclusion is that it is okay, as long as this is understood in terms of the liberty of gentlemen, the liberty that gentlemen enjoy for Shaftesbury. a rather questionable view from our end of history. But the interesting thing there is that the idea of humour, the concept of humour rather, arises in a specific context in English in the late 17th, early 18th century, right? So to that extent, discussions of humour particularly in the Germanophone context, follow from that, and you can see that through a whole number of authors who were influenced by people like Lawrence Stern, who has a huge readership in the German-speaking world. And so there is indeed, as you say, there's a story to tell about the history of humor and the history of modernist aesthetics. They kind of run parallel, and and that, I think the clearest kind of shorthand way of talking about that would be that in Kant's critique of judgment, the theory of aesthetic judgment, which has had so much influence, aesthetic judgment turns around the concept of sensus communis, of sociability, that namely what characterizes aesthetic judgment is that they have to be shared, intersubjectively shared. And that idea really comes from the theory of humor, I think. So I'd say that, I could push it to its most extreme version and say that the modern theory of aesthetics, in a way, is a reflection of a theory of humor, which maybe that would be going too far, but there is certainly a story to tell. And then what you can also lose from that, or at least it gets more complicated, is that the universalism of modern aesthetics also kind of begins to at least look more suspicious, perhaps begin to fall apart when we think about humor, where in a sense this isn't a topic I got into today, but it is indeed true that human beings laugh, right? We are Homo ridens rather than Homo sapiens, and human beings are laughing beings, and there are certain universal features to laughter, but all of the interesting stuff happens at the level of particular social detail, relative social detail, and that's what makes universalizing remarks about humor, in a sense, necessary, but also they kind of miss the point. But yeah, the point, but the force of your question is felt. Yes, there's a story to be told about the rise of modernist aesthetics and the history of humor, and they kind of run parallel. And I don't know whether Jacques Rancière has talked specifically about that. Being French, he probably hasn't, but because in a sense that the other thing is that there isn't the French idea of humor was also something. If you looked at the encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert from the late 18th century, humor was something which was attributed to the English. It was geographically identified, which is interesting. And it also means that the relationship between humor and the Reformation is really tight, right? In a sense that there can be Catholics can be comic, right? But not humorous for someone like Shaftesbury, because they're actually not free. So there's a whole story there about the way the Reformation is the kind of background to the history of humor, which we'd have to go into now, but it's a really rich area of research, it seems to me.
Well, thank you. We got a new question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon Critchley. My name is Massimo Sarabolo, and I teach Scandinavian literature and languages in Italy. I've been enormously inspired by reading your book, and even today in your lecture when you taken up some of the main points in it. But I have a problem in the sense that you, even today, you put an emphasis on humor as joke, gag, jest, but then you also say that humor consists of digression, not really in the joke.
Mhm.
And as I work with the comic novel, the tradition of the novel, which is a long narrative,
Mhm.
and in my experience, the situation that arises, smile or laugh, is not based on a single pun or joke, but on a building up a situation that
Yeah.
is comic or humorous. And so in this sense, I would like to know if you can elaborate on this. And a connected question is that of translation. You have not taken it up today, but I think it's related, because you say, and of course it's in many ways true, that jokes are difficult to translate, but then we have a European tradition of comic novel, a transnational tradition. Otherwise, I would not be able to appreciate Rabelais.
Mhm.
I don't know French, for example, or Dickens if I don't read English,
Yeah.
and so on. But you have said today, that humor presupposes a social world that is shared.
Yeah.
When you dealt with Swift, you said follies and vices of the modern European world, and I underline European. So probably this frame, this shared frame, is not always only national, but creates. And I think that translation has played a very, very important role in this exchange. So translation can convey humor. So this is a rejection, if you want, or my open question. Thank you very much.
No, sure. It's a very good. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, on the last point, yeah, translation, yeah, is a is essential, and also it works and it doesn't work. So jokes can be translated, shared, distributed, and what you said about the comic novel, yeah, I take that point. I take that point to heart. It's for me. It's a question. For me, it's a question of, I guess, of competence, or in the sense that I didn't. I could have. No, I could have. I mean, I didn't. But I could. I should have. Taken more account of someone like of Cervantes. That would have been a good thing to do, but I didn't. And when I was a lot younger, I was very interested in Rabelais. And so in a sense there is a kind of almost I don't know, looking back at the arguments now, a sort of I don't know, I was going to say a kind of a crypto nationalism in a lot of the examples I use. There is a kind of, I'm taking a certain delight in the English language, which I think is. So I take your point seriously, and translation is terribly important. And I have a lot more to say about. But in terms of the comic novel, what are you thinking of in particular? Which you mentioned? I think you mentioned Rabelais, didn't you? And the translations of Rabelais are fascinating, right?
Yes, in general, if I read Tristram Shandy in Italian, I can appreciate the humor.
Right.
Of course, some puns or jokes maybe may get lost in translation. It also depends on the translations and the translators, but on the whole, what I find is that humor is not simply depending on the joke. But then again, what you said about the digression is also very interesting.
Yeah. I'm attracted to, I guess, I'm attracted to the speed of the joke. I like, in a sense, and I like the extension of the digression. There's this wonderful, the wonderful film, The Aristocrats, that was made about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, which just is a study of that one joke, right? It's told in, an agent goes into a New York theatrical office, says, have I got an act for you? it's fantastic. They're a family act, and they come in, they're a family, and then obscenity of these obscene acts are performed. And then at the end of those obscene acts, the theatrical agent says, "What are you called?" "Well, we're the aristocrats." And that's the punchline. So that's the kind of the punchline. But the essence of the humor consists in the digression, in the elaboration of the form. And that's, in a sense, you know, a novel could be that, simply an extended digression. So the humor that most interests me and has most interested me over the years is one where there is a mastery of digression, and digression as a way of taking form and extending it over, in the case of a stand-up routine, over an hour or an hour and a half. So I think there is, for me anyway, there is an aesthetic form to comedy which is digressive and progressive, and it works syntactically. It works syntactically. I think a lot of the problems that are happening around humor, or in many ways pseudo problems happening around humor, people being offended or outraged or appearing to be outraged, often turn around a confusion of semantics with syntax. So if we think about someone like, say, Dave Chappelle, who for me is a great comic, in the sense in which he's someone that understands the aesthetic form of the extended syntactical comic sequence. You know, the shows last for an hour and a half, and he will use that form and keep returning to things, and then make digressions, and then play with the audience, and pull back and say something offensive, then undo it. And so it seems to me that anyone can tell jokes, right? Anyone can tell jokes, and you can pay people to write jokes for you, and you can talk funny, and that's but that's not the point. The point is to use this is something which has always interested me, is that why laughter is interesting is that if you can get people to laugh, then you've opened them up for a second. Right? You open them up for a second, and then you can hit them. Right? Then you can really have an effect. So once you've got someone open and laughing, their defenses are down, and then you can smack them. And that's what great comedians have done. It's what Lenny Bruce used to do. You use the gag as the opening mechanism, and then you really go after them. And of course, another great example of that recently in comedy would be Hannah Gatsby, Nanette, which I think is a really interesting example of someone who's you're watching. I hope some of you have seen this thing. It's great that she does what looks like straight kind of straight lesbian feminist humor, Australian feminist lesbian humor, and you're sort of going, oh, you recognize the form, and then she unravels it, and then she turns it into a critique of the aesthetic form of the comic, and it's fascinating to watch. So syntax rather than semantics, I think, is a key point. So I take the point about the novel, and I hold up my hands in relation to what you say. I acknowledge it.
Well, thank you. Any more questions? Perhaps we should.
Let me say one more thing about going back to translation. I mean, I remember my first trip to Helsinki. I don't know if there are any Finns in the audience or any people that have spent time in Finland, but this was in 1996, and I flew from Stockholm to Finland in a tiny little plane, and I gave a talk, and I got used to. I was getting used to kind of Swedish manners. I was to some extent becoming familiar with Swedish way of doing things, or at least the Stockholm way of doing things, let's say. And got to Helsinki, gave this talk. It lasted 20 minutes, and then we were in a bar, you know, drinking what was there was one beer that you could drink, and we drank that beer. And at a certain point, after about 6 hours of this, I said, you know, is anybody going to eat anything? Is there going to be food? Oh, food, he wants to eat. So they watched me eat, and then they carried on drinking. And actually, I mentioned this because the person that I'm thinking about that was making the jokes died last year. A guy called Ari Hirvonen. He was a very funny, very nice man. And I remember at a certain point, much later, or it was maybe the day after that, or a couple of days later, I was there for a week, and I was in this bar with a bunch of Finns, and they were falling about uproariously in laughter. Right? There were these extraordinarily funny jokes, and so I was at the other end of the table. At some point, I said, "Well, what are you laughing at?" And they tried to explain. It was completely, it was totally untranslatable, and it all turned upon, you know, the various kind of various verbal conjugations that are possible in Finnish around words to do with sweetness and sugar, and the way they could be manipulated and massaged if you've got, you know, 14 cases as you have in Finnish. The butt of the jokes was Swedes, and it all turned around sweetness and sugar. And I'll leave the rest to your imagination. Now, at that point, you realize there's something absolutely untranslatable, an untranslatable core to that humor, which is extremely interesting. And I guess I'm interested in humor as a way of expressing, you know, rivalry, as a way of expressing, you know, the feelings of being an underdog. In that case, the Finns still with that memory of Sweden as this, you know, imperial power. So the way you undermine that is through humor, untranslatable humor. The more untranslatable, the better. And then I think about that. Obviously, in the book, I talk about this, but in relationship to English language humor and the relationship between English and Irishness and Irishness as that's played out in humor, and the way in which, you know, a language is imposed or is placed in a territory, and then a certain people who are, you know, a subjugated people, the Irish, then turn that language against their colonial masters and use it in a way that they can no longer really fully understand or keep up with. That's a different kind of exercise in translatability becoming a form of subversion and attack, something like that. But yeah, these examples, but it's all about the examples.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.